Hello and welcome to the MSF Development Log number 2. I'm Anawiltus, and today I will be talking about some design elements that I would like to discuss regarding to some concept art that was hastily drawn in just a couple minutes. Just a quick sketch that I had made on a live stream using a mouse because of course, and Microsoft Paint, because of course well, maybe I'm not the most skilled drawer, but I at least tried to get the point across. So what are we exactly looking at? What we're looking at here is the first piece of actual concept art for how the human medium mech is going to look like. That is the current work in progress name. It's the human medium mech. There's also going to be a wide variant, as well as a small mech, and a wide variant of a small mech, and a different type of propulsion lancer mech, which is going to count as a small mech, as well as a large mech and a wide large mech. But anyway, those are just some basic ideas, and there's also going to be other kinds as well, but that's just what we're working with for now. Those are the things that we've gotten solid down between me and, well, I should say between Murad and I. But anyway, what we're going to be talking about here is what's actually wrong about this design. So if somebody has watched the live stream, you may already know that I mentioned that, in my opinion, the pelvic segment was a bit too large, and that the legs looked a little bit too thin. And that's just a more of a visual sense. But to actually get the artistic side of how the design should look correct, we need to actually think about the design philosophy behind the mech, as in, how does it work in universe? Why are certain design choices made in universe? And that's really most of what I'm going to be talking about today. So of course, what you may see is that the joints are round, in the sense that they are similar to a tank turret with a bit of a turret ring. And after some careful thought, I have come to the conclusion that that is actually a bad idea. And the reason I came to that conclusion is because, obviously, if you have an exposed moving part, that is going to be a very easy target for an enemy. Well, of course, it's not going to be an easy target because it's a very thin area. But let's say an enemy has a giant S-tuck or some sort of giant dagger or pick or something. That would be a very easy way to jam someone by just hitting them there, and it'd be a lot easier than if it were covered up somehow. So I decided that the original idea I had, that it would be mechs wearing armor, would actually be better than the idea of having a mech with integrated armor, which is the more common idea that I see around. So I'm thinking actually in terms of human biology and anatomy is now the way I'm thinking of when I'm designing these mechs. So what does that mean? What that means is various parts of the mech are going to be analogous to the human form. And this is, of course, not only done for in-universe design reasons of getting things to work the way I want them to, but also it is done in order to be more lore friendly, because one of the reasons why people in this universe use mechs is because humanoid objects and human form objects, when they're made and they're well made with detail, they acquire a sort of a spirit to them. In this case, it would be a mech soul. And when it has this type of spirit to it, it makes it immune to the majority of various forms of magic, which, of course, And why is that relevant, you may say? Well, because one of the other forms of magic is a type of magic that can essentially destroy pretty much anything. And being immune to that is a pretty significant tactical, not just advantage, just as plain utility. Because if anyone is capable of casting this magic that just destroys anything, what you would want to have is a device that is fully immune to that. And that's why people use mechs. So once we have this idea down, and understanding that the reason why mechs are immune to this magic is because they have this quality of personhood that they otherwise would not, then you may ask, how do we then emphasize this in the design? And of course, one way that we can do this is we can look at the skeletal structure. And this is actually one of the reasons why I decided to go back to the previous idea I had of having the mechs be wearing armor rather than simply having the armor directly as the exterior of the mech. So why am I thinking about the skeleton? Well, I realized that having a shoulder joint that is just a ring is actually not very conducive to fluid motion. And a good way to demonstrate this is to essentially just hold your shoulder in position and only move your arm directly up and down on your shoulder joint, and you'll realize that there's a lot of limitation to exactly the types of movements that you can make. And knowing this, you then have two options. You can either make additional joints in order to additional round joints in order to smoothen that out, as some really thick deep sea diver suits have, where it's just a whole ton of round joints, and it looks really it looks like you've got several big bubbles on you. But of course, the reason for the doming has more to do with being pressure resistant rather than the roundness of the joints. However, it is an interesting design anyway. But the way I decided to go is to actually take it to be more like the way that it works with a human being. That the way the joints work is that they, of course, are places where the bones attach to each other, and then the muscles can pull. The skeletal muscles are anchored on the bones, and they contract, pulling a certain direction, and there's multiple muscles that pull different directions, and that then determines exactly how the joints move. And that also comes with the idea of a skin. Now, of course, I'm not going to have a little smooth synthetic skin on the mech. I could have that as a concept, because this is science fiction and fantasy fiction. Anything can happen. But I'm thinking maybe I'm not going to go that far. The skin is, of course, going to be, in essence, metal plates that are, of course, shaped in the general shape of a body, and they aren't really for protection in the sense of armor, although they would, of course, be completing a chamber that is hermetically sealed and has enough thickness on the outside wall to be radiation shielded for obvious reasons. And the armor, then, the way the armor attaches is that from the internal bone on the body part, there will be beams that come out, and they go through the skin, the skin layer, and then the bones, the beams that come out of the bones that come through the skin layer then go past the skin and jut out a bit, and that's where the armor is attached. And the armor isn't attached in this simple way of wearing it, even though I've used that analogy so far quite a bit, but it is actually put onto the beams. And one advantage of having the armor not directly on the skin is that if damage occurs to the armor and the armor is penetrated, then the penetration of the armor won't actually push in and penetrate the skin directly. Which is also one of the reasons, among others, why plate cuirasses aren't directly on the skin in the center of the chest. They're a bit jutting forward a bit. There's other reasons as well, for example, deflecting blows, but one of the reasons is that if you, let's say, had a warhammer or fighting pick, Bec de Corbin or something, and you hit and you actually manage to penetrate on the center of a cuirass, which is actually pretty difficult to do, but let's say you just managed to penetrate, it wouldn't go all the way, and the metal wouldn't dig through your skin and into your flesh, which is not what you want happening. So that's one of the rationales for having the armor not directly on the skin. And what this allows us to do is, when it concerns the protection of the joints, and you look at historical armor, you've got different models on how this can happen. You can have a flap of armor that comes up and covers the joint, or you can have a piece of armor that juts over from, let's say, the upper arm. There'll be a piece of armor that juts over the armpit joint in the front and in the back. And of course, you still have the mobility, but it's got some protection from the front so that you can't get directly stabbed in the joint unless you take a really weird angle and get stabbed that way. So that's that concept. Now, of course, internally speaking, the skull, there's not really going to be a skull because, I will just have really thick armor and it's directly attached on the head, because that's also where the main operations cabin is going to be, the cockpit, as some might call it. And when it concerns the actual weapons that are attached on the outside of the armor, for example, the chest modules, the main ammunition for that is going to be in between the skin and the armor. So it also adds to the modularity of it. So if you want to switch to a different chest module, you just pull it out from the armor, and you don't have to necessarily deal with messing around with the actual internal body as much. And then, of course, we've got the nervous system, which is going to be the commands that are wired throughout the mech, and that's of course going to come down from the head, down the spine, and spread out along the limbs. And when it concerns things like the chest modules, it's going to be coming, of course, through the attachment points and out onto the specific chest modules and the back module, assuming it is a weaponized back module in the sense that, let's say, a trebuchet or a catapult or something, as opposed to, alternatively, you could have a backup weapon that you just carry on your back. And that's another interesting thing to mention here. So you've got the skeleton, you've got the muscles, you've got the skin, and you've got the nerves, and of course the circulatory, the circulatory and the pulmonary system is, of course, the mechs aren't going to actually breathe. We're going to have a bit of a power source. Now, the exact type of power source for the inside of the mech, I haven't really decided what it is going to be. Of course, since I'm using both science fiction and fantasy fiction, it can be pretty much anything. So that's not really the most important part to decide at this point. However, for, let's say, the human medium mech, there's going to be a dual power core, just so that there's a backup. And the way the damage works is that, of course, there's the armor on the outside, and that has a specific damage amount that it can take. But there's also, once the armor is either destroyed, or if you get a really good shot and you penetrate the armor directly and you manage to go through, and you can go through the skin and hit the internal components, then it's going to be a dice roll as to which component you're going to destroy, because the components themselves, they're not going to have a specific health. Because if you think about it, if you actually manage to fire a high-powered rifle through a car and you hit the engine and the bullet penetrated the engine, does it really matter how damaged the engine is, or is the engine damaged either way? And the same thing with the mechs here. The weapons that we're going to be using are relatively powerful, so we're going to assume that if you manage to get past the armor, it's a guaranteed damage on some component, probably. So, of course, there's going to be other components, and we're not going to have an analog to the digestive tract, unless there's a specific fuel for the power source, but that's not going to go through the mouth. It's just going to be something that has to be installed directly, or maybe there'll be a port on the back or something, or on the side for that to go through. But then when, no reproductive organs, of course. That's something I'm not doing, because they're machines. They don't need to use reproductive organs. Although, in another story, I do have a concept for machines that are significantly advanced to the point where they do actually procreate, but that's a different story. And no, it's not a sexual story. No, that's just an element in the story that's not really going to be fully analyzed in the story. And maybe see you in 20 years when that finally comes out. But anyway, another question might be, what are the mechs made out of? Or what material can you have that's tough enough for these mechs to be made out of, so that you can't just normally collapse under the weight or do this, that, and everything? Well, I decided to actually take a book out of my own page and go with a concept that I myself had discovered in my analysis on power scaling. And that is the idea of multiple sets of dimensions. Or as I referred to them at the time as hyperdimensions, or I could refer to them as superdimensions. But anyway, the idea is that spatial dimensions, of course, are, from what we see in our universe, 3 dimensions. But theoretically, on a mathematical models, you can have an infinite number of them. But then, you think about it, you're counting dimensions in a linear manner. So, theoretically, you could count dimensions in a spatial matter, or in a planar matter. That is, instead of counting dimensions unidimensionally, you can count dimensions multidimensionally, multidimensional counting, and therefore you have an infinity of dimensions on top of that, where you have whole new sets of dimensions that come out. And the same thing you can go on the 3rd dimension. And so, understanding this concept, and then you could theoretically have in more sets of those, because at this point you're counting the sets linearly, and therefore there's an even greater infinite amount of potential dimensions. But knowing this concept, I decided to go about it this way, by using interdimensional entanglement. And that is to say that these the material, the metal alloy that the mechs are made of, the mech armor is made of, and the weapons are made of, that material is also, in some way, it's not an unusual material, as in its natural properties aren't unusual. However, it has then been magically enchanted to be entangled with material that exists on other spatial dimensions. And most people don't understand the concepts of dimensions. Most people don't understand the concept of dimensions properly, and they end up saying that another dimension is a whole alternate universe or something, which that's not what the word dimension means. But in this instance, there's the three-dimensional universe, and then there's another three-dimensional that exists in the same universe but does not intersect. And you may ask, what does that mean? That means that there are three dimensions, okay, that are parallel to the original three dimensions, but the objects that exist in the dimensions 4, 5, and 6 do not exist in dimensions 1, 2, and 3. Therefore, the dimensions exist in the same universe, but are parallel to the other dimensions, and therefore constitute a different set of dimensions. And so, by entangling these objects onto an existence on the other three dimensions, it gives an additional strength to these objects that makes them a lot tougher, in the sense that the way that's going to play out in universe. And let me just say, the physics on this are not explored at all scientifically. So if anyone just plain out says I'm wrong, know that I probably am, but there's probably no one who's right either. But anyway, the way that would work is that the bonds that exist on the other three dimensions cannot be broken by bonds that only exist in the first three dimensions. So let's say you were to take a regular object of the same material that is not entangled, and you used it to try to break the entangled material with an equal strength that would work with normal unentangled material, then it would not work, because you would not only be trying to break the bonds that exist in the dimensions that we exist in, but because it is entangled, you would also be attempting to break the bonds that exist in the other three dimensions. Therefore, its cohesion is at least double that than that you would normally expect to see. And I think that actually works on some level, as in I think it's logically coherent to some extent. And of course, I'm not fully familiar with many others who analyze higher dimensional constructs and the questions of parallel dimensions, but that's also how the FTL is going to work, that it has to do with parallel dimensions rather than warped dimensions, as is usually the more common norm, with warped dimensions, examples being well, I guess one example would be Star Trek's warp. Wormholes is another example of warped dimensions. Well, it depends on what causes them, but usually it's a warped dimension. Multiple warped dimensions, spatial dimensions, of course. Just to be very clear, that we do have a parallelism in the sense that we're using the same kinds of dimensions, and we also have a parallelism dimensionally in the sense that the dimensions are parallel to each other across the different dimensions. So then there's a potential infinite number of dimensions, many of which may or may not be parallel to the three dimensions that we spatially operate in normally. But anyway, thank you all for listening. I hope this was interesting enough for someone to at least understand what I was saying towards the end, and tell me what you thought about my ideas when it relates to design. And if you want to join on the project, I'm happy to have you, as long as you actually have something to offer. Now, that could be any number of things. I'm thinking that I'm actually getting some information close enough together that we can actually perhaps perform some play tests. And having testers is going to be very useful. But just know, at this point in the project, there is no hope for any profit. We're not making any money. We're not even at the stage where we're planning to make any money. We're not even incorporated or anything. Just so everyone knows, don't expect to make money. This is just a project that we're doing for fun, just to see if we can make a game. And maybe if it looks like something good enough, we'll make some money. And if you're on the project at that time, then maybe you'll make some money. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Abultus, over and out.